That one weekend changed everything. My stepmom asked me to stay home while Dad was away, and at first I thought it was no big deal, just another weekend. But something felt different this time. The way she looked at me, the things she said, it was like I was seeing a whole new side of her. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake this feeling that something big was about to happen. I thought I could handle it, but that night, things went way further than I ever thought they would. I still can't believe where it led. That night changed everything in ways I never saw coming. It all started with a simple request from my stepmom, Emily. As my dad packed up for his regular fishing trip, she asked me to stay home that weekend. I figured it was routine, just the two of us while Dad was away, as it often was. Little did I know, that night would mark the beginning of something that would push boundaries I never expected, leaving an unforgettable mark on my life. The house felt strangely quiet that evening. I finished my homework and wandered downstairs, trying to shake off an unusual sense of loneliness. Emily called to me from the living room, asking if I could help her with something. Her voice was soft, almost casual, yet I detected a subtle edge to it, a hint of nervousness I'd never heard before. I hesitated for a second, then shrugged it off and walked over. "Can you sit here for a minute?" she asked, patting the couch beside her. There was a slight tension in her voice, a vulnerability that surprised me. As I sat down, she looked at me with an intensity one hadn't noticed before. It was like she was seeing me not as a kid, but as something more. "You've grown up so much," she said, her eyes lingering on mine. Her words hung between us, laced with something unspoken. "You're not the little boy I used to know." I could feel my heart beat a little faster. I stammered, "I guess I have," unsure how else to respond. The way she looked at me was different, intense, almost like she was studying me. Emily leaned back, crossing her legs and studying me. "It's just strange, seeing you like this. Like you're changing. I don't know if you've noticed it too." The statement felt heavy, the air charged with something I couldn't quite place. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, tell her she was being silly. But another part of me, the part that felt her words in a way I didn't want to admit, stayed silent. "Emily, what are you trying to say?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Her gaze didn't waver as she stood up and walked to the window, staring out into the quiet yard. "You know, your dad's gone for the weekend," she said quietly, a hint of something unreadable in her tone. "It's just us." I nodded, suddenly feeling a knot form in my stomach, though I couldn't pinpoint why. She turned around, her expression unreadable. "There are things I've been wanting to talk about with you. Things I haven't had the courage to say, until now." I swallowed hard. "Like what?" Emily took a step closer, her gaze steady and intense, locking onto mine. "Like us," she said quietly. The word hung in the air, and I felt my pulse quicken, unsure of what she meant. "What do you mean, us?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though my heart was racing. I wanted to laugh it off, to pretend it was nothing, but her eyes held me in place. She smiled, a small, knowing smile that sent a chill down my spine. "You've noticed it too, haven't you?" she asked, her voice soft. "Things are different between us. We're not just stepmother and stepson anymore. Are we?" My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of her words. Deep down, I knew what she was talking about. I had felt it too, the shift that had been building over the last few months. But I had always convinced myself it was nothing, just my imagination. I don't know what you're talking about." I lied, my voice barely a whisper. Emily stepped even closer, her presence overwhelming, filling the room. "Yes, you do," she said softly, her fingers brushing lightly against my arm. Her touch was electric, and for a moment, I was frozen, trapped in the intensity of her gaze. "Emily, this is crazy," I managed to say, though my voice trembled. "You're my stepmom. We shouldn't." She didn't back away. Instead, she closed the small distance between us, her eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that left me breathless. "Why not?" she whispered, her voice filled with a longing that made my heart race. "We're both adults. We don't have to follow anyone else's rules." I shook my head, trying to push away the pull that was drawing me closer to her. No, this isn't right, I insisted, though even as I said the words, I could feel my resolve weakening. But what if it is? She countered, reaching up to touch my cheek. The gentle warmth of her hand sent a shiver down my spine, and for a moment, I was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to resist. My mind screamed at me to stop, to walk away, to end this before it went any further. But a stronger, undeniable part of me kept me standing there, inches away from her, unable to break the magnetic pull between us. The tension in the house was unbearable. Every glance, every unspoken word seemed to carry a weight that pressed down on both of us. I tried to avoid her, to stay out of her way, to keep some semblance of normalcy. But Emily seemed to find every opportunity to be near me, even in the smallest ways. An accidental touch on the arm, a lingering look from across the room. I could feel her everywhere, and it was driving me insane. Then came the night everything changed. My dad was working late, and I was holed up in my room, trying to distract myself, hoping that if I stayed away long enough, this tension might fade. But it was like ignoring a fire that was slowly building, a fire that had already begun to consume me. Deep down, I knew this wasn't going to end well. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. I could hear Emily downstairs, the faint sound of the TV in the background, the clinking of a wine glass against the table. I paced in my room, trying to find the courage to stay there, to avoid her, to pretend this was all a bad dream. But the pull was too strong. I found myself at the top of the stairs, listening to the silence that filled the house. I took a breath, and before I knew it, I was walking down the steps, each footfall feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the living room, Emily was sitting on the couch, a glass of wine in her hand, her gaze distant as she stared at the TV. She didn't seem to notice me at first, or maybe she did, and pretended not to. I hesitated at the edge of the room, unsure of what to say, unsure of what I was even doing there. "Can't sleep?" she asked, her voice soft, casual. The way she said it, with that same underlying tone, made my heart race in a way I couldn't control. "Yeah," I mumbled, not trusting myself to say anything more. I walked over to the couch and sat down, leaving as much space between us as I could manage. But even with that distance, I could feel her presence, thick and undeniable. For a few moments we sat in silence, the quiet hum of the TV filling the room. I could feel her watching me, her eyes lingering, as if searching for something. My skin tingled under her gaze, and every second stretched out, the air heavy with something unsaid. Finally, she broke the silence. "I've been thinking about us," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Emily, we can't," I started, but she cut me off before I could finish, her hand reaching out, covering mine. "Why not?" she asked, her eyes locked on mine. "Why are we pretending there's nothing between us when we both know there is?" Her words hit me hard, like a punch to the gut. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, to insist that we couldn't do this. But the truth was, I didn't have the strength to fight anymore. I'd felt it too, this strange pull between us that had only grown stronger. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it wasn't real. But now, sitting there with her, I couldn't deny it any longer. "We can't do this," I said, though my voice lacked conviction, even as I spoke. Emily leaned in closer, her hand resting on the cushion between us. "We're not doing anything wrong," she whispered, her voice low and intense. "We're not hurting anyone." I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my thoughts, the part of me that knew this was dangerous. "But it's not right," I argued weakly, feeling the struggle inside me slipping away. She reached out, placing her hand on mine, sending a jolt through me that made my heart pound in my chest. "Who decides what's right and what's wrong?" she asked, her eyes never leaving mine. "We're adults. We can make our own choices." I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sound of her voice, the feel of her touch. But it was no use. The walls I had built around myself were crumbling, and I didn't know how to stop it. I opened my mouth to protest, to tell her that we couldn't do this, but no words came out. Instead, I found myself turning to face her, our eyes locking as every rational thought slipped away. Without thinking, without planning, I leaned in and kissed her. It started soft, hesitant, as though we were testing boundaries we both knew we shouldn't cross. But quickly, it deepened, the heat between us rising as we gave in to a desire that had been building for so long. My hands found her waist, pulling her closer as her fingers tangled in my hair, and in that moment, the rest of the world faded away. It was just the two of us, lost in the intensity of the moment, crossing a line we knew we could never come back from. As the kiss ended, both of us were breathing heavily, our faces inches apart. Her eyes were dark, filled with an intensity one couldn't quite name, and I knew then that nothing would ever be the same between us. The night unfolded, filled with stolen touches and whispered words, each moment a mixture of exhilaration and guilt. When we finally parted, exhausted but unable to shake the lingering pull between us, I lay there in the quiet darkness, grappling with what we had just done. Over the following days, the air in the house was charged with an undeniable tension. Every brush of her hand, every passing glance, reminded me of that night and the unspoken promise of what might happen again. It was as though we were balancing on a knife's edge, drawn together by something that both terrified and thrilled us. I knew that what we had started wasn't right, that we were playing with fire, that we were setting ourselves up for consequences we couldn't escape. But I also knew that no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't bring myself to stop.